I'm going to read the first line under the acknowledgments from Bernice Regan's book, If You Don't Go, Don't Hinder Me. And she says, why would one for whom voice unleashed in air is the primary and strongest medium of presentation also move to the printed page? And I have an answer for Bernice this morning. It's because there's a timekeeper in here somewhere. And the first thing I want us to do is to kind of raise our voices together a little bit. Can we do that? Let's sing together and get the energy flowing a little bit. So if you stand with me, and we're just going to do something that I think is appropriate since we're out here this early, right? An old favorite, call and response. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. How about that? Now, I'm going to tell you that I'm really checking to see where the altos, sopranos, and tenors are. So I'm going to ask you, I always do this check, where are the altos? Altos, look, put your hands down for a minute. Let me talk to the rest of you. We got to work on this. Altos outnumber us every time, okay? So I commission you to bring forth sopranos and tenors and baritones. So where are the sopranos? Okay, tenors, bass baritones, and God bless you all, I don't know. Never fails that some of the same people raise their hands. It's okay. That's all right. We love you. We love you. Are we ready? Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I said I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. You know I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Well, you know I'm walking and talking with my mind. Walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. You know I'm walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Now young people in North Carolina say, I'm texting and tweeting with my mind. Texting and tweeting with my mind. Stay on freedom. I said I'm texting and tweeting with my mind. Stay on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Last time, you know it ain't no harm to keep your mind. Keep your mind. Stay on freedom. I said it ain't no harm to keep your mind. Stay on freedom. All together. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Yeah. That right there was the Revolutionary Love Justice Jump-Off Choir. Now, if I can get through this, we're going to do one more at the end, all right? So that's why I wanted you to kind of move together. I heard some harmony, and I don't like pointing people out, but I heard a soprano that I didn't know. That was... Okay, so you know, when we start talking about music and revolutionary love, and standing for truth, we have to take in consideration how we implement music within this framework. So as we build music and build movements, and as we move through campaigns, we have to give music an intentional place. It cannot, I repeat, it cannot be an afterthought. And in too many movements and too many situations, music has been an afterthought. And here's why we have to make it intentional. It is because music has the power to shift the atmosphere. And here is how it shifts the atmosphere. It does this by creating what Dr. Wyatt T. Walker and Dr. T.V. Reed calls a space for collective identity. And that speaks to why we're here, in this place, at this event, at this time. And then it creates something else that they call collective effervescence, which is what we just experienced when we all sang together. And this speaks to what happens after we get here. So I like to call it, and I'm going to date some of us in here right now, I like to call it the fizz after the plop plop. And if you got that, you're at least 50. I just dated myself real bad, didn't I? I did. Music has the ability to confuse the opposition. Now, in my family, I'm from the South, so give me this. We have what we call remember that time moments. Not remember that time. So will everybody say, remember that time? Remember that time that Gideon went in to war against the Midianites in the scriptures? Well, Gideon started off with an army of 3,000. Okay, let's put a bookmark right here because I want to tell you that you don't need choirs of 600 voices. You don't have to have that to be effective. So Gideon started out with 3,000, and I think in my artistic head that God said, we are not buying all those choir robes, and we're not doing that. We're not doing that. So you need to whittle this down to 300. And Gideon took the 300 in, and God says, here's how I want you to go in. I want you to tell your soldiers to take clay vessels, trumpets, and lanterns. And Gideon, when you go in, you give them your 1, 2, 3, 4, you give them the downbeat, and I want them to break the vessels and blow the horns. So again, in my artistic head, that's where the first Earth, Wind, and Fire came from. Did y'all get it? The clay vessels, earth, the trumpet, wind, and the lanterns, fire. You got it? I know. So Gideon did what God said and went in, and the Midianites were so confused when they heard those sounds that they turned on each other. We're seeing some of that right now, aren't we? Seeing some of the same things. And so music has, wait a minute, okay, so here's another example that I tried not to use, but I know you're going to connect with. How many of you watched How the Grinch Stole Christmas? Now, sometimes in movements and campaigns, music will draw people to your message. It'll draw people. And it's what they hear first sometimes that changes their heart and changes their positions. And we saw that in Moral Mondays when we started playing our music and you could hear it 6 and 7 blocks over, and it was powerful music with powerful messages. People were jumping out of their cars on the corner to come over and see what was going on, and it led them to the bigger message. So back to the point that music confuses the enemy. You remember when the 45th president went down to Whoville? And took everything from the people. You got it, right? Took everything and went back up. And you remember the poor little dog. I don't think he really wanted to go along with it, but he had to stay true to his party. So he went. He went, and they took everything, and they went back to Grinch Mountain. And he was satisfied that, okay, we got him. They have nothing else. Then he heard them singing. He didn't look over and see them first. He heard them, and it did something to his heart. What did it say his heart did? It grew. It grew. That's right. And so a lot of times the power comes from what people hear, and then it draws them, again, to that bigger message. So I said that music has the ability to shift the atmosphere. It clears the channels for the prophetic word, okay? We see that in churches, and I don't know how many faiths are represented, but a lot of times you see the choirs come up and sing before the preacher or after. Now, it's very important that they have the right message when they sing, because you can sing people into apathy. You can do it. You can sing people into a state of, I don't care, I'm not moving. So the preacher spends 45 minutes saying, stand up, let's stand up and fight, stand up for justice. And here comes the choir saying, sit down, servant, sit down. Rest a little while. You just killed the preacher's message. He's trying to get you to stand up, or she's trying to get, stand up. And here you come. Auburn is saying, trouble the waters. And the choir sings, Jesus will fix it. You see what I'm saying? And it sounds funny, but there's a whole lot that goes into messaging in music. And so music has the power to speak to every human emotion. Every emotion that you can think of, there's music for that. And so it also has the power then to bring people together and to create solidarity. So in the past and the present movements and campaigns, people threw their bodies, as Bernice Reagan says, they threw their lives against a system. And they planned and they protested and they practiced civil disobedience. And they came against oppression however it presented itself. And in all of those practices, music was a very strategic, intentional part. It didn't just, now there was some spontaneous music on the protest line, but you better believe that they knew that music had to be the life's blood out of there on that protest line, because it encouraged people. Can you imagine how tough it was? Now, we protest, but I don't know, raise your hands if you've protested with dogs at your feet. Batons, and some people have. It's scary. When you see the gas mask and all that, can you imagine the fear? Can you imagine those students who gather at Highlander to plan and were raided by the police? And they had to join together and start singing, "We Shall Overcome." And then the verse was born, "We are not afraid." Can you imagine the power of that moment when they all sang, "We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today." Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we are not afraid. brings me to this point. Music does not always have to be high energy to be high impact. It does not always have to be high energy. Do you remember the song Amazing Grace? How impactful that song is? And there are times when you're up against opposition and the song comes, "Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God." Now that's a different kind of be still, right? So we have to take it in context, which is why we have to create and we have to vet our music and we have to make sure that it's the right message for the right time. So our job as revolutionary artists is to help promote music that is subversive versus subductive, disruptive versus destructive, and dissident versus conforming. So we have a big job when it comes to music. Now, so if solidarity is mutual support within a group, and if it's harmony, and if it is consensus, and if it is common interest, then we have to put that into practice. So let's stand again. Now, I'm going to go out here on this, and I'm going to trust that you're not going to let me down. Because I believe that everything is music. Everything has a tone. Researchers say that the earth spins in the key of C, and that even the planets have their own key that they spin in. And so my favorite song, one of them anyway, is a song by India Ari. And the song is Always in My Head. Now at the end, there's a hook that goes, "How can I live without music?" And then she says, "How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without you? How can I have that revolutionary love if I don't have music? You're always in my head." And for us to do this revolutionary work, we have to have our own song playing in our heads, all right? So I encourage you to adopt your song, whatever your song is. Adopt that song, embrace it, put flesh on it, because that's what our ancestors did, and that's our call, is to put blood and bone and breath to song. I even believe that when Ezekiel looked over in that valley and he saw those bones, again, in my artistic mind that tends to wander, I think that not only did he speak, he threw in a little, bones live now. Well. Now, you know, back in the day, old people would say, and I don't know if you subscribe to this or not, angels, devil, I don't know. But the old people used to say, when you hum, the devil don't know what you're talking about. And so I kind of think Ezekiel went, you know, whatever it was, breathe, whatever. Oh, bones live, get up and live now. And that's the part of the devil's like, what in the world's going on? Okay, so I want to try this hook. I've never done this with anybody before. Y'all don't let me down. I don't know, those of you who raised your hand, hang on to the person next to you, okay? All right, here we go. How can I live, altos? How can I live one day without music? Let's put love. How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without music? You're always in my head. How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without music? how can I love one day without you, okay? How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without you? How can I love one day without music? You're all, keep that going while we get the sopranos. How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without you? How can I love one day without the sopranos? Music? You're always in my head. Music without music. How can I love one day without you? How can I love one day without music in my head? How can I love one day without music? How can I love one day without you? Music in my head. Let me hear that. How can I love one day without music? Music without you. Music without music in my tenors. Don't let me down. Keep going. Keep going. Thank you. How can I love one day without music in my head? I can't live. I can't live. I can't live without you in my head. Go. I can't live. I can't live. I can't live without you in my head. All together, how? How can I live one day without music? How can I love one day without you? How can I love one day without music? You're always in my head. That sounds good.
Good morning. It's always, always a privilege and a burden to follow my sister Yara. She does indeed open up some things and makes me emotional, and I don't want to cry this morning. I want to acknowledge all of you who are up this early. My daughter asked me, "What time are you speaking?" And I said, "Right after Jesus gets up." I want to thank my sisters Jackie and Valerie for the invitation. Thank you so much for having me. It's my first time at Middle Church, and I have been blessed by this entire conference. As I sat there thinking and listening to what Yara had to say and knowing that she's telling the truth, on last week I was here, I think it was last week, it's all running together, in DC for Ecumenical Advocacy Days. That was this week. And I had not intended to break my record of not being arrested. I went through all of Ferguson, and I was always the one to get everybody out. That was my assigned role. I'm a little claustrophobic. And so the thought of being in a jail cell that I don't have a key to did not appeal to me too much. And so I would volunteer to get people out when they were arrested. But this week, timing has a way of sneaking up on you. And we were in the Hart building, the Senate building, protesting. I knew that we would be protesting. I knew some people were going to get arrested. I knew that I was not one of them. But in the course of being there, the police said something that pissed me off. And when you get pissed off, you do things that you would not normally do. I found out that prayer is actually considered an act of protest in federal buildings. I didn't know that, especially since we're taking government back to God. It seems odd that prayer would be an act of protest that you could be arrested for. I was fine with that. They said if you pray or you sing within the building, you will be arrested. We'll ask you 3 times to be quiet, and if you're not quiet, then you'll be arrested. I made myself okay with that, but then the officer added another piece. He said, and if you go outside of this building and you raise your voice in song or prayer, we will drag you back into this building and we will arrest you. That pissed me off. So the singing began. And the singing started out with movement songs, just like you said, Yara. And then when I saw those handcuffs coming, it went to Amazing Grace. But a beautiful thing happens when you sing for freedom. Because as I began to sing Amazing Grace, the group with me began to sing Amazing Grace. And then I looked up. If you've never been in the Hart Building, there's a center and there are balconies about 4 or 5 floors up that people come out on. And I began to hear Amazing Grace in the rafters, where people who had come out were beginning to sing Amazing Grace. So it was a transformative moment. That moment also reminds me, for those of us of the Christian faith who just finished celebrating the Resurrection Sunday, the pastor's greatest nightmare in the liturgical calendar. I was reminded of a young man, his name is Taryn, at my church, and he's only 5, and for 3 years we've been trying to get him to do an Easter speech. He's afraid to speak in front of people, and so every year we have this ritual. He'll say he'll do it, and he'll get up there, and he freezes and never says a word, and we applaud anyway, and he gets off the stage. But this year, he gave his speech, and I was so excited after church. I said, Taryn, you finally did it. You conquered your fear. You're not afraid anymore. And he said, no, Pastor, I'm still scared. And I said, well, what made you do the speech? He said, I just did it afraid. Revolutionary love is often about doing it afraid. See, courage is a funny thing. It's one of those things we always talk about after the fact. You never really know whether or not you have it or how much you have until the moment you need it. Now, I'm not talking about keyboard courage, because most of us in this age of cyberspace have lots of keyboard courage. We will say to people behind our keyboards things we would never say to their face. We will go on rants behind keyboards in ways that we would never do in a face-to-face conversation. We will bully people and make people feel uncomfortable, and in some unfortunate cases, even drive people to self-harm in ways that we would never do if we were just face-to-face. I'm not talking about keyboard courage. I'm talking about an inner resistance that rises in each of us when we are confronted by the presence of a power that we simply can no longer withstand. Revolutionary love begins with love of self. Unapologetic love of self. Sustainable change does not happen until you love yourself enough to fight for what you know is right. Sustainable change does not happen until you love what you know is possible more than you fear what you have in your present moment. Without that love, we will have many revolutions. I call them abortive revolutions. Revolutions that fail to secure power after temporary victories and large-scale mobilizations. Revolutions that make a lot of noise, but don't make a lot of difference. Without love, we do not sustain change. We may morph into something different, but we soon find out that it looks about the same. On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown Jr., an unarmed 18-year-old black man-child, was shot 7 times and killed from a distance of 148 feet away by a law enforcement officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Police documents confirm that the entire encounter between Officer Wilson and Michael Brown lasted less than 2 minutes. It was less than 2 minutes from the time when Officer Darren Wilson drove up on unarmed Michael Brown and his friend who were walking back to Michael's grandmother's house, and Michael being shot multiple times because, as an unarmed pedestrian, Michael was perceived to be a threatening presence to an academy-trained armed law enforcement officer who was inside of a police vehicle. It's easy to debate and dissect the events of this case or the many other cases like it. We've been discussing and debating the value and validity of life in black and brown skin since the invention of whiteness. And I suspect even in this space, we may have differing opinions about the validity of this stop and the state-sanctioned murder that happened afterwards. I evoke the memory of Michael Brown this morning, not so that we might try to determine whether or not this human being deserved to live beyond the age of 18, but rather to lift for us a series of questions. Why is blackness a threat in America? And how are we, as people of color, ever to be perceived as unarmed and therefore non-threatening if blackness is the weapon that is feared? I ask this question not only on behalf of people of African descent, but I ask this question on behalf of our nation, on behalf of black and brown people of every origin. If criminalization and incarceration of black and brown bodies is the solution, then what is our problem? If deportation of our brown bodies is the solution, what is the problem? If those who were integral to the creation of this country as we know it are not welcome to enjoy the fruit of their labor, then what does that say about our humanity? And more importantly, in this setting, as people of faith, what does it say about our God? My faith was activated, my courage was activated in new ways as a result of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. on that hot August day. We all have our moments when we must compel the words of justice and mercy and love to leap from the pages of our sacred text and become enfleshed in the actions of our everyday lives. And for me, that happened anew on August 9th. For me, that moment was the unnecessary and unwarranted killing of yet another black life. I want to say that yet another black life, for Michael Brown was not the first black body to die in 2014 in August. He was not even the first black body to die in Ferguson. He was number 169. And the realization that the targeting and dehumanization of non-white bodies will never stop unless we stop it. It was the realization that as a person of faith, and indeed as a proclaimer of the gospel, that I have a moral obligation to use my body and my voice to sound the alarm against the evils of racism, sexism, heterosexism, xenophobia, classism, and all other forms of oppression that deny the breath of God in any of humanity and the hand of God on all creation. You must find your center in this fight. My center is the church, because that's where I live and move and do my work. And so it would be absurd for me to find my center in the streets telling other people what to do and ignoring the oppression that is with me every day in the work that I do. You see, race is not a biblical term. It is used nowhere in sacred text. Race alone cannot be used to differentiate culture or context or class. The sole purpose of race is to create a false hierarchy. And that hierarchy is morally reprehensible and antithetical to the gospel. Disproportionate wealth, that's a symptom. Concentrated political power, that's a symptom. The commandeering of natural resources, that's a symptom. Even the killing of Michael Brown Jr. is a symptom. What happened to Michael Brown did not start with that encounter in Ferguson that day. In the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown, really in the aftermath of the uprising, the Department of Justice investigated the police force of Ferguson. And looking at the statistics alone, the investigation found that although blacks make up 67% of the residents of Ferguson, from 2011 to 2013, black people accounted for 85% of all vehicle stops by police, 90% of all citations, 93% of all arrests, 94% of failure to comply charges, 92% of all peace disturbances, 92% of all resisting arrest charges, 92% of cases with warrants issued, 95% of manner of walking charges, which is what Michael Brown was accused of. They were twice as likely to be searched, but 26% less likely to have contraband found when searched. 88% of all cases of use of force in Ferguson is on black people. 68% less likely than others to have our cases dismissed. And in all 14 cases of the use of force involving a dog bite, Yara, yes, dogs, all 14 cases were black people. So when we talk about revolutionary love, I'm suggesting to you that love that is passive, love that doesn't get angry about this, love that doesn't resist, is not love at all. Michael Brown was killed within a social, political, and theological context that lauds love of God, love of humanity, and love of creation as its highest principles. We do not differ greatly on interpretations of love. It is our interpretation of humanity that challenges us. Who are they that can legitimately claim to be created in the very image of God? And what does revolutionary love look like in the face of such dehumanization? What happened to Michael Brown, I want to say to you here today, can be traced back to the interpretation of Scripture in manners that validate a theology of chosenness that professes some of God's creation to be more valuable and therefore more worthy of respect, more worthy of love, more worthy of elevation than other parts of God's creation. This theology allowed the taking of indigenous peoples' land so long ago, supported by the doctrine of discovery. This theology allowed the capture and enslavement of people, subjugating some of God's people to treatment as chattel rather than as human beings deserving of dignity. This theology continues to allow the poisoning of our water supplies, the corrosion of our land, the pollution of our air in the name of a progress that worships a God of capitalism. This theology is what happened in the bishops' conference last night in the United Methodist Church. This theology is killing us. And revolutionary love must begin by people of faith understanding that what we are facing at its core is not a political problem, it's not a social problem, it's a theological problem. A while ago, I preached at Mother Bethel, the founding church of African Methodism in Philadelphia. And I was struck at this service because at the service was also the pastor of St. George Episcopal Church, the church from which the African Methodist tradition left in protest and began the AME Church. I was struck by the words of the pastor of St. George as he retold the history of Black people being relegated in the church to the balcony of the sanctuary in the church, and how after years and years of such oppression, that courage finally showed up in Richard Allen and Absalom Jones to stand up while they were praying at the kneeling rail, being interrupted because it was time for service and time for Black people to take their place in the balcony. Instead of going to the balcony, they said, just let us finish our prayer and we won't bother you anymore. And on that Sunday, they walked out of the church in protest and in love. This pastor of St. George, this current pastor, said that I cannot get that image out of my head even though I wasn't there. And every Sunday when I mount my pulpit, after I pray and welcome people in, the first thing I do is look up in the balcony to see who we have relegated there this week. And I am saying to you that it is not just true for St. George, but it is true for our churches all over this nation. Revolutionary love means dismantling the balcony. And sometimes it gets ugly. And sometimes it's confrontational. And sometimes it doesn't feel good. And yet it is still necessary. We have embraced a theology that is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And our path to redemption and restoration must begin first in the church, first in communities of faith with confession. Confession. My first entry into Ferguson was not with my fist up, saying, follow me. My first entry into Ferguson was leading clergy into the apartment complex where Michael Brown was lived, and owning the truth that even though my church was 3 miles from there, and even though all of the ministers at that point were local, that the majority of us had never stepped foot in Canfield until that moment. Owning that truth, that the people who we needed to reach already knew. Not making excuses and not making lies and not coming in with tracts and not coming in with the Bible in one hand unless you had food in the other. And standing in the middle of that complex with a bullhorn and confessing and repenting to these people who didn't know who I was on behalf of a church that had failed them. Yes, a church that they were not a part of. But you know what? The sin was not that they were not a part of the church. The sin was that we didn't know they were missing. Many Many of us have constructed for ourselves a theology that does not serve this present age. We have extrapolated from the sacred text words that affirm us without holding us accountable. We have imagined a God that acts for us and not with us, a type of spiritual charity devoid of conviction and compassion for the other, that justifies our complacency in the face of oppression. For me, a call to revolutionary love is a call to resist. A call to revolutionary love is a call to confront racism and to dismantle white supremacy and all of the structures that undergird its existence. It is the acknowledgement that America's systems, and not just America, but indeed this world's systems, have not been implemented in ways that support the gospel. And the declaration of our faith cannot be extracted from the confrontation of injustice wherever it's found. It means not running. It means doing it scared. It means standing up for what's right, even if you feel like you're standing by yourself. Ours is a call to community, and community does not mean sameness, it means collaboration, as evidenced in this room. As we talk about environmental justice issues, there's a professor at Texas Southern University, Robert Bullard, who is widely recognized as the father of environmental justice and climate change issues. In DC today, they're having a large climate change march. He calls what we're dealing with an apartheid system of global decision-making. Bullard was also vehement that racial disparities in transportation and zoning and health and waste disposal and in local communities intensify global pollution. Equity has to take center stage because people who have contributed the least to climate change and global warming are the ones that feel it first, feel it the worst, and feel it the longest. So justice cannot just be a footnote on our spiritual dossier. Justice has to be at the center of everything. I had the occasion to have an audience at the Vatican a few years ago. And I went and did what we often do in this work. We're together all the time in settings like this. We have our phrases that get us riled up. And one of mine had become that racism is America's greatest sin. I believe that. I said it in almost every talk I went to, except until I met Cardinal Turkson. Cardinal Turkson is a Catholic cardinal. He resides in Rome. He is the author of the encyclical on climate change. He's from Ghana. I was having a conversation with him in his office, and I said to him, racism is America's original sin. He stopped me. He said, daughter, I would like to challenge you on that. I said, okay. He said, I would suggest to you that racism is not the original sin of America. The original sin of America is the same as the original sin everywhere in this world. The original sin is our desire to be God. And out of our desires to be God and not work with God comes all forms of oppression. Because when you desire to be God, then you will presume that God loves what you love, God hates what you hate, and God acts as you act. The sin is our desire to be God. We are not God. We are servants of God. And the dangers in this work is that if we don't find our center in understanding this principle and knowing for ourselves where we fit into the cycle, is that we risk becoming that which we fight against. We become the gatekeepers of worthiness, just like the gatekeepers we choose to dismantle. We buy into the commodification of the movement, the commodification of the struggle. We fight against liberation in the name of liberation, because what we really desire is not the dismantling of the empire, but to be the empire. And until the church grapples with this within ourselves individually and collectively, in love, but in truth, we will continue to see what we see today. We have more bodies of faith than anything else in this nation. So if we got it right, we shouldn't be where we are right now. It starts with confession. It starts with deconstruction. It starts with Sunday school. It starts with Bible study. It starts with recognizing that God is not made in our individual image, but we in God's.
The world is too beautiful to be praised by just one voice, and too broken to be healed by just one set of hands. And that is why we need these companions and this community for the important work of savoring and saving the world. These words are from my colleague, Reverend Rob Hardy's at All Souls Church Unitarian in DC, and these words have grounded us at All Souls since November. And I say them now partly to express our thanks for the bringing together of these companions, all of us here. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, all the organizers. Thank you for this opportunity for all of us to hearten and strengthen one another through our presence here. The morning following the election, people began to arrive at our church. There were no meetings scheduled, but people came. One young adult said to me, "I don't know where to go or what to do. Can I just hang out at the church today?" By evening, when we began ringing the bell for our regular Vesper service, people literally were streaming into the sanctuary. They came seeking touch, connection with others, and seeking a sacred space of beauty. There were no political speeches that night. We lit candles, sat together for long, silent meditation, and chanted our prayers. Gathered here in the mystery of this hour, gathered here in one strong body, gathered here in the struggle and the power, Spirit, draw near. Come and fill our hearts with your peace. You and all the world are holy. Return again. Return again. Return to the home of your birth. Return to who you are. Return to what you are. Return to where you are born and reborn again. We all know this is a critical moment for our nation. An avowed sexual abuser has been elected to the highest office of the land. An abuser who first rose to political prominence by leading the charge as a white man, to discredit the legitimacy of the nation's first African-American president by lying about him over and over and over again. Racism and heterosexism are now on the throne. And bodies that were already at risk, already being harmed, black bodies, brown bodies, women's bodies, Muslim bodies, indigenous bodies, queer and differently abled bodies, and Earth's body are now in even more danger. This backlash moment is like what happens when a woman in an abusive relationship takes steps to leave. She moves out. She declares she will no longer submit to violence or be seduced by lies that she has loved. She takes the steps to create a different life, a new life, and that is the most dangerous moment for her. That's when everyone who works with domestic violence knows. That's when the abuser will try the hardest to stop her. And that's when she most needs not to be isolated. People have been moving out of the house of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy for some time now. The Poor People's Campaign, the Rainbow Coalition, the Obama Coalition, Occupy Wall Street, etc. For some of us, this has been a lifelong struggle to name the lies, face the harm, grieve the lives lost, repair the damage when we could, heal ourselves, and create alternative, life-giving communities. And now, the backlash has intensified. And so more than ever, we need not to be isolated. We need to form protective circles for those most at risk, and we need solidarity in the flesh. And for that, we need to continually build our capacity to be there for one another, be there with one another, having one another's backs, not betraying one another, proving ourselves to be trustworthy and faithful. And this is not easy because we do not forge solidarity with one another in the midst of our differences on a level playing field. We come to coalition building from diverse locations, each with our own mix of internalized oppressions and unexamined privileges, our own combination of unhealed wounds and power. We come to the coalition beautiful and broken, strong and overburdened, ready to act and needing to rest. And solidarity in the flesh requires us to be changed by our need for one another and by our desire to truly do right by one another. So here are a few field notes. I have 3 on the changes and transformations solidarity in the flesh requires of us within our own communities of resistance. First, those of us who are white, who have been shaped to be carriers of white supremacy, and therefore are in captivity to the power of white narcissism, need to get over our benevolent paternalism. Benevolent paternalism is so pernicious within us, it's a lifelong task. But here's a story of how I first began to learn this. When I was a young minister, the church I served made a commitment to be in solidarity with refugees during the first sanctuary movement. Refugees were fleeing torture in Central America and South America, and refugees were fleeing the genocide in Cambodia. The Cambodian refugee family who came to be with us included a father, Tom, a mother, Mealia, and 3 small children. We took them in, helped them get settled in an apartment, start ESL classes, helped Tom find work, and helped Mealia with the childcare. About 6 months after they arrived, when things seemed to be going well, I got a frantic call from the chair of our refugee committee. Mealia had called her in tears and in a panic. Tom had left them. He'd taken their little bit of savings, their car, and left a note saying he was not coming back. Mealia was abandoned with 3 small children. Knowing she was without any cash, I immediately rushed over to Mealia's home, bringing bags of groceries, which I hauled into her kitchen. Pushing past her, I started filling up her shelves and her refrigerator with the groceries I'd brought, all the while telling her how sorry I was that Tom had left, but that the church was there with her. We were going to get her through. We'd get her signed up for more ESL classes. We'd help her find a job. We'd organize childcare for the children. Mealia watched silently and then came over and put her hand on my arm and said, "Stop." I stopped and turned and looked at her, and she said, "Why can't you just be my friend? I don't need all this." And then she motioned for me to come sit by her on the couch. "A friend," she said, "would listen to me." Mealia disrupted my absorption in being the rescuing hero. Caught up in my own confidence that I knew what was needed and I would provide it, she asserted her actual presence and asked the same from me. Benevolent paternalism or benevolent maternalism isn't solidarity. It's just another form of white supremacy acting out its ignorance of itself and of others. Truth was, my own spouse had left me around the same time. Mealia knew that, and what she expected of me was that I could and would be with her in truth, as a human being, face to face, in genuine I-thou meeting. Lesson: when someone you think you are helping takes the trouble to tell you that what you are doing is not helping, listen to them. Better yet, if you want to help, start by showing up and asking, what is the help that will really help? And then don't debate it, don't question it, just do it. Revolutionary love in the flesh is grounded in friendship, in the forging of friendship that goes beyond a dynamic that perpetuates the power of the privileged and the presumed helplessness of the oppressed. Together, we can break this frame and experience a different communion, a life-giving connection, human being to human being. Second, solidarity work requires us to give attention to what must be done to recover from and resist the impact of hostility and opposition. The reality of backlash is that it causes real harm. it harms actual bodies. It harms souls. And its goal is to put pressure on the bonds of relationship and connection that are the sinews of our communities, movements, and progressive institutions. I learned a great deal about the resistance of whites to the transformation of liberal white institutions over the course of my 25 years of work at Starr King School for the Ministry, where today, what was once a historically white liberal institution is a counter-oppressive, multi-religious, and multiracial theological school. But every step that we took at Starr King School to move beyond the school's historic white liberal religious identity met with levels of resistance that I initially was completely unprepared to see or respond to. When I started at the school in 1990, the school's core faculty, staff, board, and student body were almost entirely white, and it had been so for nearly 100 years. I felt strongly that a white enclave, even a liberal religious one, was not an adequate context in which to educate religious leaders for the actual context we are in America. The actual context of a nation forged through racial violence and exploitation that benefited whites. Also, it was clear to me, as a nerd and a scholar, that the most creative, interesting, empowering, and transformative scholarship in theology and religion and ethics was being produced by people coming from historically marginalized communities and identities, such as queer theology, womanist and feminist theologies, and more. So we set about bringing into being a transformed community for teaching and learning, with women and people of color in the lead. Our first step was to hire 2 men of color for our faculty, and when we did, the backlash began. Backlash from white religious liberals. The process was decried as faulty. The fact that white men esteemed holders of what we used to call tall steeple churches, that such white men did not get the job was lamented. People sent hate mail. And the school's largest donor quit, pulling all his funds and writing a letter to our top 50 contributors asking them to withhold their giving to the school, and along the way, accusing me of mental instability for having advocated this change, as well as sexual immorality, for having led the school down this path. When we appealed to our denomination's board of trustees for backup, our appeal was met with silence. The men of color who accepted the call to be part of the school's faculty had to face hostility in the classroom from white students who had never been instructed by a person of color. And they also had to deal with a storm of public outcry about their insuitability for the role. I narrate this in some granular detail in order to lift up the reality of what people of color have to engage with if they choose to be part of the transformation of historically white liberal religious institutions and movements. And I would like to call their names. Those people of color whose energy and creativity and love helped transform Starr King School. Yobanzi Charles Johnson, Alma Faith Crawford, Ibrahim Farajage, Amina Wadud, Ghazala Anwar, and now the new president of the school, Rosemary Bray McNabb. The pattern of backlash that began with that first set of appointments of people of color has continued as a pattern every time a person of color was moved into greater leadership at the school, including most recently when the school hired its first woman of color president. The process was challenged. I was called immoral for my participation in the process. And Rosemary Bray McNabb had to step into leadership in a context of troubled waters, and not the kind of troubled waters God wants. We can say of the school, nevertheless, she persisted. The school. But this pattern of backlash and its toxic impact on the hearts and minds and bodies of the people working for this change took a toll on people's spirits, people's physical health, on the relationships among the people. And we have to be honest in our facing into the way the cost of backlash actually hurts us. And we have to take time to heal, to recover, to support one another, and find the ways to resist these impacts. One of the things that helped us, just one moment, was when our Board of Trustees met, and after considerable hand-wringing and worry about how we were going to go forward, since about 15% of our income stream had been dropped by people who stopped supporting the school, one of the white men on the board, and we were having all this criticism, one of the white men on the board who was solidly behind the commitments we had made said, well, we just have to learn to interpret the sound of shit hitting the fan as applause. And this brings me to my third field note. Solidarity work needs joy and laughter. Joy and laughter can break through the power of fear and open a space for human connecting.
So much has been said already. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join you this early morning. It's very rare for me to be up this early on a Saturday, but I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Jackie. I'm particularly excited about the focus on revolutionary love in a moment that screams of lovelessness. So many of us, some of us, live daily under the conditions of lovelessness. Racism is lovelessness. Antagonism towards our LGBTQI sisters and brothers is lovelessness. Poverty is lovelessness. Sexism, misogyny is lovelessness. The inability to make space for our disabled sisters and brothers is lovelessness. So I'm happy to be here to think about and reflect on love. I did have something prepared, but I decided today, I sat down and just wrote some notes and wanted to try to speak from my heart. But before I speak, I want to reflect on the balcony for a second. Thank you for that. I want us to think about not only the balconies in our religious institutions, but the balconies that we've constructed in our lives, our everyday lives. Let's call this the edges of the margins. And I want us to think about who in our lives and our spheres are situated in those balconies. Who have we left out of the conversations? Who have we refused to give our care and love to? And I want us to bring them in the room. Let's do that for 30 seconds. It could be someone we have political differences with. It can be the neighbor we actually live next door to that we never speak to. It can be somebody else whose size is different than ours, whose faith is different than ours. And I ask that we bring them in the room because it behooves us to do so, partially because we think events like this. I actually used to get really tired of coming to the choir events. Makes us feel good sometimes to know that we got up in the morning, to know that I got up and got dressed to come here to talk to y'all with my tie on, to give you good language, to use words that we might share in common, to feel good about my progressivism. And after having performed all of that, still having balconies constructed in my life. After having marched, after having given a good sermon, after having talked and waxed poetic, after having had my fist up in the air. There were people, bodies, on the edges of the margins I had still yet to come into community with. And that's why I'm glad we're talking about love. Because I define love as that force that removes the expanse, the space that exists between us and the other. It gets rid of it. And I wish I could sort of model this. Who's in the back? Who's furthest in the back? Wave your hand for me. Yes. Meet me here in the middle, please. Walk towards me. We don't know each other, do we? But love, really, as a force, is the energy that removes the expanse. It allows us to get over the barriers. And even though we don't know each other, love has the potential to bring us together, doesn't it? Can I have a hug? Now, that's real cute. It's real cute, but I want to tell you why that's political. Because I'm really not interested in cheap love, hallmarkish love, the type of love that sort of neoliberalism engenders, the kind we place on cards, the kind we give each other on February 14th, the type of love that says, yes, I love you, but I'm not going to do anything to change my way of life, to change institutional practices, to get rid of some things that bring me comfort such that you can live your life better. Love, real radical love, also requires justice. So if I'm going to meet you in this aisle, it means I got to do whatever it takes to remove whatever barriers are constructed to keep us apart. But guess what? Some of us actually are responsible for some of the barriers that are in people's place. So what do we do to remove those? I'll tell you once I can get to my notes. Imagine loving a thing that hurts you or being told to. I remember when I was watching the aftermath of the tragic shooting in Charleston at the AME church. And some of my friends on Facebook were encouraging folk to pray. To pray for forgiveness of the young man who walked into the church and shot dead. Congregants who only gathered to pray and to sing and to be in community. And I thought to myself, that's cheap grace. And it's very similar to cheap love. These sort of performances, these acts that we commit ourselves to without being committed to justice. Love actually requires the end of victimization and violence, while all manner of violences are being enacted upon me. But the thing that I've learned over the last several years, both doing local organizing and work and work across the country is that each of us at any moment can be victims and sites of violence. That is, we can be the victims and sites of oppression, and at the same time be the victimizers and tools of violence. I'll say that again. We can both, all at once, be a victim and a victimizer, a site of oppression and a tool of oppression. Which brings me to point one that I want to share with you in terms of a tool or a tactic. Self-reflexive analysis is a key to our own transformation. Well, what do I mean by self-reflexive analysis? It means one must be clear about what one's stuff is that one needs to fix. I often say, in this sort of game of radical movement work, we have become skilled at naming all of the forms of oppression that exist outside of us. The way I say it is, we know and can name very clearly whose feet are on our necks. I can tell you all day about racism. I can tell you all day about what it feels like to walk through the world evading gender boxes, what homophobia feels like. But it took me some time to really understand sexism. It took me some time to really understand trans misogyny. It took me some time to really get into and understand what it means to live in a capitalist society that allows some of us to have and others to have not. In other words, the call, or at least the end goal of self-reflexive analysis should be this. It allows you to analyze whose necks your feet are on. And that's not fancy, fun work. So when I come to events like this, don't talk to me about what everybody else is doing. Talk to me about how you might be implicated in any of the things we're talking about. Because that is what real love, revolutionary, radical love, asks of us to do. But you know what's funny? I don't get a lot of claps on that when I tell people that. Because we want to walk out of spaces like this feeling like we did something. I want to walk in women-only spaces and say, but sisters, I'm also the editor of the Feminist Wire. Clap for me. Only to be told or to realize that is my job anyway. Patriarchy don't just harm women. It evades our human potential, all of us. So in spaces like this, I'll repeat that. The first work is self-reflexive analysis. You can't be in community, in relationship, unless you're ready to analyze self, to figure out where you're located in the matrix of oppression. Remember, we all can be tools of oppression, even as we oppress, all at the same time. And we need to recognize that. That make sense? Yeah. The second thing, and I like to talk about self-reflexive analysis before I actually talk about self-transformation, because one cannot renew one's mind, to use that language, or one's practices unless one knows what needs to be renewed. And that is our work to do. Our work to do. I often tell my sister friends, I'm not going to put you in the place of having to mother me into a type of life, a way of life. I'm not going to ask you to teach me how not to do to you what will hurt you. I'm not going to burden you to do the work that is necessary for your survival. That is my work to do. It's time up for us, really, especially in this Google generation, of asking of those who are situated under the soles of our feet to tell us how to move the feet off of to move your feet off of their necks. I'm tired of telling straight allies, I like that word, how to show up. I'm tired of telling white folk how to be better accomplices in the struggle. I'm tired, actually, of coming into spaces like this. God knows I've been in so many conferences, demanding of us not just to talk a thing, but to be the thing that we're talking about when we leave these doors. How dare us? And I'm talking to myself, too, here. Yeah? But this is, to me, what it means to be in radically loving relationships with folk. What will it take to transform a self so that we're not just talking about intersectionality, but you're actually locating the I in the intersection? The third thing I'll add is this point about reciprocal solidarity. And I don't just talk about solidarities, but I talk about reciprocal solidarities. If you want me to march in your parade, in your march, you should march in mine. That's the way I think about it. Let's show up for each other and be prepared to fight for each other in reciprocal ways. Actually, this is a term that a brother friend of mine, Saeed Ashton, Palestinian Quaker professor, and I had been ruminating on what it might look like for what Palestinian and Black liberation struggle might look like together. And we realized that reciprocal solidarity requires some dirty work. For us, it meant that we needed to untangle the type of anti-Blackness that might be present among some of our Arab brothers and sisters. And for him, it meant that some of us in the Black community might have to think about our Arab resentment, our antagonism towards those of us, especially in some of the communities we live in. And it meant that we had to wrestle, really, and to be honest, and to be clear, in order to really show up for one another. The fourth thing is what it means to reshape our world. And, I got to give this story. I was on my way to a protest in Union Square, I think, once. And I can't remember the person on behalf, whose behalf we were protesting on, because how many people have died and been killed by the state between then and now. But on my way to the protest, I'm ready. I was ready. I had my T-shirt. I might have been Troy Davis. Had a T-shirt on. I'm ready to go out here and put my fist up in the air. And I remember walking by, and I got on the A train because I live in Bed-Stuy. And I said, I can't believe I just walked by about 4 people and didn't speak to them. It sounds really simple. But I stopped and said, how radical is that of me to be on my way to this protest where I'm going to go and put my fist up in the air and never stop to speak to the neighbors, my Black neighbors that I walked by to get to the protest? How radical is it of me that I got to the protest and never turned to the person next to me and said, what's your name and who are your people? How radical of me to have left that protest. I remember once I was at one of the protests for economic parity or something, and walked by a Black woman working, handing out flyers to those of us on our way to the protest, and never stopped to say hi. Never stopped to say, did you take lunch today? Can I actually take those flyers for you and pass them out? This is the real type of work the real type of radical love that I think our moment is asking of us. In other words, if we cannot, in the micro spaces of our lives, live out the things we preach, the politics we espouse, then there is no radicality present. And that's a big deal, y'all, particularly in this moment where optics are so important. It's important when, when we sort of judge a person's radicalness, their progressiveness, based on sort of things that they say, the performances we do. But I'm really interested in what we do after all that is done. When you log off of Facebook, how many of us know the names of all the people in our blocks and in our apartment buildings or in the spaces where we exist? And those are important too. And the last thing I'm going to say here, I'm going to refer to a term that Robin Kelley, a historian, talks about freedom dreams. And I often imagine and ask, who's alive and present in your freedom dreams? Who do you see in a liberatory future? And who isn't present? And then I ask, how might your freedom dream constitute someone's nightmare? So many of our dreams are constructed and constricted, really, restricted by so many things. Our connections and access to power, our connections and access to safety. And now I'm at the point where, for myself, I've begun to really reflect on the people that have been left out of my freedom dreams. The people on the balcony, those folk who exist on the edges of the margins, like our trans sisters, who are being slain in very high numbers, but yet the feet hitting the ground doesn't seem to match up to those that do when black cisgender men are unfortunately slain. I'm asking the question, why? I'm asking myself, who haven't I invited to the table? Whose present have I resisted? And I'm asking myself that because I realize in order to change a world and to make this world better than what it is, to materialize a freedom dream of which Robin Kelley asked of us to meditate on, if we don't work on these micro spaces in our lives, at the things you do at your kitchen table, the things we do in our workplaces, the things we do in our church houses, that big, lofty, liberated world we imagine will never, ever materialize. So I'm encouraged today in ways that I typically am not when I'm in conferences. This feels much different. I feel like I'm among people who showed up and got up very early because you're committed. Otherwise, you would not have. But I will encourage us to know that this is not the work. It's part of it. It's part of it. But the real work is going to be what happens when we leave these doors and what we do when we encounter the other when we leave the doors. And hopefully we'll have that embrace. We'll have love moving us towards one another, always with justice, always with us willing to remove any obstacle in the way, and always with us ensuring that we aren't the ones putting the obstacle in the path. Thank you so much for the time.
I want to respond to something Darnell said, which is something I wrestle with all the time. This tension between the ways that I personally am oppressed in this society with the privilege that I have in this society, and pushing myself to not just be comfortable in the oppressions, right, which are multiple, but so are the privileges. And what it takes, the great amount of effort it takes, I'm telling my story, I'm not saying it's you, to remain cognizant of that privilege when it would be easy for me to slip into the way I'm oppressed as a Black person, the way I'm oppressed as a non-married woman, just all of that, right? And not look at the tremendous power that I wield in the church, even though I'm a woman who preaches, right? I have a friend, and I'll be quiet, who helped me, and you made me think about that years ago when I had my epiphany about all the ways that I contributed to the oppression of same-gender loving people and my awareness around that. And it was like when you are blind and you get some glasses, I mean, not literally blind, but can't see well, right? And you get glasses, and then you become aware of everything that you were missing because, you know, the world was cool with you when you didn't have the glasses, and you become aware. And everything is this new awakening. And I have many same-gender loving friends, but I have some that I'm closer to than others. And I have this very close friend named Rudy. And every time I would discover something, I would call Rudy, right? And I'm just being honest, right? No matter what time it hit me, I would wake Rudy up, you know. Have you thought about this? Every time. And our relationship went from us just being friends to him being my gay resource. Maybe that's never happened to any of you. And I would have these awakenings. I would call Rudy, and because I'd have questions. I'd be awakened, I'd have questions. I'd call Rudy because Rudy became safe space for me. And I guess I called Rudy one time too many. I remember this life-giving moment. And I was in my room, you know, in my house, in my bedroom, and I called Rudy, and I'm talking to him about this, and he just didn't say anything. I said, Rudy? He said, I'm here. He said, I need to tell you something, sister, because I love you. I am so glad that you have been awakened. Really, I am. He said, but I need you to understand that your need to know everything about gayness has not created in me a need to educate you. Right? That's that distance, right? He said, you're not the first person to wake up. You won't be the last. But this is what I need you to do. Do your own work. And then bring me what's left. And that's what I heard you saying. No matter what it is, right? Read you a book before you ask me about Black history. You get what I'm saying? There are a lot of things about religion that I just don't do because I'm Christian. I haven't had to do it. All my holidays are covered. No, seriously, right? But doing this work and meeting people who are not Christian, not just seeing them, but meeting them and caring about them, right? Has forced me to do my research and do my work. To be cognizant that every time I'm off, everybody's not off. Every day that I consider holy is not what everybody considers holy. Interfaith services don't mean a Christian service with a few extra people thrown in. So what you helped me is to be transparent and to be true about that. that we have to continuously do our work. And I thank you for that.